Hello, I'm John Dickerson of Slate magazine, and this is Washington Unplugged, CBSNews.com's webcast on politics. I'm your guest moderator this Friday, filling in for Bob Schieffer. You'll find us here every Friday afternoon at cbsnews.com/Washington Unplugged. Each week, we try to give you insight into the headlines that will drive the news next week. This week, the president's stimulus bill has moved through legislative conference so quickly, members of Congress are still figuring out what's in the bill. Nevertheless, the House and the Senate are expected to vote on the updated legislation today. Meanwhile, Senator Judd Gregg surprised the president and everyone else by pulling out of consideration for Secretary of Commerce. The job may be cursed. This is the second Obama nominee for the post who hasn't worked out, and the fourth top Obama official who will never serve. What really happened? Does the loss of a Republican cabinet appointee say anything about the limitations of bipartisanship in the Obama administration? We will chat with White House Deputy Press Secretary Bill Burton. Also, tragedy in Clarence, New York. We'll get the latest on the Colgan Air Flight 3407 plane crash, which killed 50 people last night. Nancy Cordes has been watching this story all night and will be with us here on Washington Unplugged. And later, our political roundtable is here to dissect these issues for you. I'll be joined by CBS News Director of Political Coverage, Steve Chigueras, and Eamon Javers, financial correspondent for Politico.com. Finally, we have Thomas Ricks, the Washington Post's senior Pentagon correspondent. You may know him from the New York Times bestseller list. We'll be talking about his new book. It's called The Gamble, General David Petraeus and the American Military Adventure in Iraq, 2006 to 2008. But first, President Obama admitted that Senator Gregg's withdrawal yesterday came as, quote, something of a surprise. Let's listen to the former appointee try to explain his switchback.
But for me, I just realized as these issues started to come at us and they started to crystallize that it really wasn't a good fit and that I wouldn't be comfortable doing this and that it wouldn't be fair to him to be part of a team and not be able to be 100% on the team. So with that in mind, I've said I'm going to withdraw from this process.
Senator Gregg's withdrawal brings the number of Obama appointees who will not serve to 4. Gregg says, as a Republican, he felt he could not be 100% a part of the team. What really happened? We have White House Press Secretary Bill Burton here. Let's ask him. Hello, Bill.
Hey, John.
So what exactly happened? Senator Gregg says he had talked to the president as early as the beginning of the week, but a lot of White House officials and the president indeed himself suggested they were kind of caught off guard here. What happened?
Well, I think that what's most important here is how we're moving forward. I think there's been a lot of discussion over the course of the last couple of days about, what conversations happened when and that sort of thing. And at the end of the day, it's true that Senator Gregg had some misgivings about the position, and so decided that he didn't want to serve. And, we're moving forward. We're going to have a strong nominee who's going to fill that role, and we're going to continue to move forward. Now, I heard in the lead-in you talk about, what status is, where does this leave bipartisanship here in Washington? And I was with the president yesterday as we went to Illinois, and he is still the eternal optimist. And he really feels like we are going to be able to make a lot of progress as it relates to working with Republicans and with Democrats in order to make progress on the things that are important to the American people. That's what we've seen with this plan to get the economy going again and put people back to work. He's opened the doors here at the White House to Republicans who have come here. He's gone up to the Capitol Hill to talk to Republicans in the House and the Senate, and it's a long process. I don't think anybody thought that we were going to be able to change the ways of Washington overnight, but I think that we are making progress, and he is optimistic that we're going to be able to make more progress as time goes on.
Okay, very good. Progress is being made. But what the question is about Gregg and the 3 Republicans that you were able to get for the stimulus package is whether you're finding a new line here. You can have Republicans over, you can go up to the Hill, you can talk to them, and that's all very nice. But that at some point philosophy kicks in. And at some point people like Senator Gregg just come up to hard problems with what the president is proposing. So have you found the new line here? I know you're trying to be optimistic, but is there a new line you've discovered about what's philosophically possible when you're talking about Republicans?
Well, there are philosophical differences. There's no doubt about that. And that's why we had elections. And that's why, in this last election, what the American people said very clearly was that they wanted President Obama to lead this country, and they wanted to see some change in Washington. They wanted to see folks working together to actually make some progress. And so I think that this is the beginning, not the end of a process. Yes, we were able to get some Republican support for this economic plan, and we do think that moving forward on some of the other big issues like energy, like healthcare, there's going to be maybe the same Republicans, maybe other Republicans who want to get involved in those issues and make progress.
Bill, is the president still working on Republicans as we speak? Is he still trying to get more votes for this final legislation?
You know, I think it's safe to say that, it'd be great if every piece of legislation that the president supported had the support of every member of the House and the Senate, and he's going to continue to work to make sure that we get as much support as we can. And we feel good about the progress that we've made on this bill. We know that it's going to put billions of dollars into the economy, put people to work right away, get infrastructure projects going, get tax cuts to people who need them most.
I only have a minute here, so
okay.
It'll do lots of good things. What have you learned about the inside game versus the outside game in Washington? The president went on the road this week. It's more of a campaign mode. Is that more effective than the cocktail parties and the visits to the Hill?
Well, I'll say this, that there's a lot of things that are happening out in the country right now that I think folks in Washington, that he wanted to make sure folks in Washington understood that the jobs numbers when they come out aren't just statistics that come out of BLS. It's families in places like Elkhart and Fort Myers and Peoria that are hurting right now. And that's why this sort of plan and legislation is needed right now in order to get the economy going.
All right, Bill Burton, thank you very much for joining us. We'll hopefully speak to you again soon.
Thanks, John.
Last night, 44 passengers, 4 crew members, and 1 off-duty crew member perished in a plane crash from Newark to Buffalo. CBS News' Nancy Cordes has been up all night following this story. What can you tell us?
Well, John, this is really a mystery at this point. This airplane, a turboprop plane that normally can carry about 74 passengers, was about 2/3 full, was in its final approach to Buffalo late last night when suddenly it just dropped off the radar screen. Everything had been normal up until that point. The crew was in communication with the air traffic controllers. They sounded fine, they sounded upbeat, and then suddenly 2 minutes later when air traffic controllers tried to reach them, they got nothing. And when they continued to get nothing, they reached out to other airplanes in the area and said, do you see this Continental Connection flight operated by Colgan Air? And the other pilots said, no, we don't. And eventually they realized that the plane had gone down just a few miles from the airport, and pilots started to report that they could see the plane on the ground.
So there's been some reports from other pilots in the area about ice. Is that an issue, a factor here, something they're looking into?
This is going to be a leading possibility, this possibility of ice building up in the area. The weather conditions were right for it. After the crash, the air traffic controllers started to ask other pilots that were flying in the area, are you seeing ice build up on your wings? And they said, yes, we are. One even said, I have about a 1/4 inch of ice on my wings, and that doesn't sound like much, but that can bring down an airplane, specifically a propeller plane, if it isn't managed very carefully.
Okay, Nancy, thanks very much.
Sure thing.
We try to involve our audience in Washington Unplugged and welcome you to email your questions to WashingtonUnplugged@cbs.com. You're watching CBSNews.com's Washington Unplugged at CBSNews.com/Washington Unplugged. I'm joined now by CBS News political director Steve Chagaris and Eamon Javers of Politico.com. This week in Florida, President Obama candidly put his neck on the line, saying what few presidents have in their first month in office. Let's take a listen.
I mean, I expect to be judged by results. And there's no, I'm not going to make any excuses. If stuff hasn't worked and people don't feel like I've led the country in the right direction, then you'll have a new president.
Steve, we don't have a new president yet, but apparently we're going to get a new Secretary of Commerce. Judd Gregg is gone. What happened here? Did Judd Gregg just flake out, or did the Obama administration make a bad choice in the first place, knowing, as many in Washington did, that Judd Gregg is a very sort of hardcore fiscal conservative with fixed ideas?
I think Judd Gregg said it yesterday. I think he had a change of heart. I think he, had all the best intentions getting into this, thought about it over the last 10 days and realized, I can't work with these guys. I don't agree with them on a lot of this stuff, especially the stimulus. And, I think he just had a change of heart.
I mean, is this a larger change of heart we're seeing here among Republicans and even maybe indeed in the White House about what's possible in this great era of bipartisanship we were supposed to get?
Well, look, whether Greg had best intentions or not, this was a real political slap in the face to Barack Obama. He went after this job, he was in meetings with the White House, and then he turned around and said no in sort of the harshest way you can and still remain a statesman on Capitol Hill. That's a problem for the Obama administration. They need to look deep inside their own team and figure out, why is this continuing to happen to us? Why are we missing some of the key signals with our nominees, and what can we do to fix that? They're making a lot of rookie mistakes here, and they've got to get this thing back on track.
So I'm going to try a premise here that may be overblown. But we remember in the early days of the Bush administration, we remember Senator Jeffords, okay? He left the Republican Party, became an independent through the Bush administration in turmoil. He became a symbol for this kind of my way or the highway. Right. Does Greg become a symbol, almost regardless of the facts of the case, does he become a symbol for the limitations of bipartisanship throughout the Obama administration?
I think it does. I think that, combined with what's happened with the stimulus and the fact that he tried, President Obama that is, tried really hard to get Republicans to join up with him on the stimulus and basically got no support. So I think combining those two, I think they realize maybe this is more trouble than it's worth. You know, we're still going to get the stimulus package passed, and we don't really need the Republicans. I don't think you'll hear Obama saying that, but I think that might be creeping into their thinking a bit.
We also saw the president this week do two things that only a president can do. He was in the East Room with that press conference on Monday, and then he went around the country, Air Force One landing in towns, creating blanket news coverage. Did that work for him? Did they learn something about the power of the presidency?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Air Force One is a huge symbol, and that rally in Florida this week was almost like a religious revival meeting. I mean, the intensity of emotion for Barack Obama was really extreme, and that's the asset that he's got as president. That's the bully pulpit. He can use that to push the debate on Capitol Hill, but inside the Beltway, I think the Obama administration might need to drop back and punt a little bit on this idea of bipartisanship. It's one thing to have everybody over to watch the Super Bowl together and improve the tone and general relations and comity, as they call it in Washington. It's another thing entirely to convince everybody that you're right and expect that no one is going to disagree with you anymore. That's not where bipartisanship is going in this town. I think we learned that very clearly this week.
After this big show of the presidency, the Republicans didn't change much, though, in response to it. In other words, the president threw everything he had at them, and they're still likely to vote against this bill. The president's still lobbying for it. So where are the Republicans now at the end of this process with the stimulus bill?
Well, I mean, they don't really need to. They're basically hoping this thing doesn't work. I think they're looking ahead to 2010. I think they're looking to say, look, if this stimulus package doesn't work, the Republicans are saying we're going to be in good shape in 2010 because we can say the congressional Democrats, really muffed this. And they'll have something to run on in 2010. I mean, it's almost a desperation attempt on their part, but they don't see any political need for them to sign up with this bill.
And what do you guess the president will do now? What lessons, in terms of his next hard decisions he's got coming forward, how do you think he'll behave differently now for this next round?
Well, in the inside game, he's got to go into his team and figure out why they're missing these signals that are showing that some of these problems are coming and step on that and get that problem fixed. The outside game, we're told at Politico that they're going to just step on the gas and they're just going to go for it. They're going to continue with their agenda, and if the Republicans aren't going to cooperate, they're going to leave them to the side and go with the votes that they've got in the House and the Senate to get their agenda through.
That's right. Rahm Emanuel's been talking about, we talked too much about bipartisanship at the beginning. Well, it was the president who was talking about that. Do you think that's just gone now in terms of the president?
I think you'll see the president continue to reach out, but I think ultimately that they may have felt that, they don't, this may have set the bar a little too high trying to go for this bipartisanship, because at the end of the day it became a focal point and it became basically a scorecard. Where's the bipartisanship? And it became too much of a distraction to them, and I think maybe they don't think they need that going down the road.
That's right, and the score was just 3 Republicans in the Senate. Even George Bush, not known for his great bipartisan tendencies, got more than that on his first big piece of legislation when he was president. So, Steve, Eamon, thanks very much.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks.
I'm here with Tom Ricks, the author of The Gamble, the American Military Adventure in Iraq, 2006 to 2008. Welcome, Tom. Before we get to the policy, I just want to ask you about the book, because there's a great story inside here of insurgents inside the Pentagon taking over. You've got a diminutive British woman who's a pacifist. Tell us a little bit about the story inside this book.
Sure, it's quite a striking story, and I didn't know it going in, even though I've been covering the war for the Washington Post. How much it was that in 2007 the war was turned over to the dissidents, to people who had fundamentally disagreed with the invasion or who thought the war had been executed wrongly. Ambassador Crocker, the top American diplomat in Iraq, for example, reveals in the book that he had opposed the invasion. A lot of the people they brought in were, as you say, unusual advisors to have. Three of the most significant advisors were foreigners: an Australian infantryman turned anthropologist, a Palestinian American who was also a pacifist, and Emma Skye, this diminutive British woman who was anti-American and anti-military, but thought the right thing to do was to help the Americans at this point in the war. It was a very different war. There was a lot less hubris in the American effort and a willingness to talk to even enemies, and as General Petraeus eventually did, a willingness to put the Sunni insurgency on the payroll.
So your first book, Fiasco, was the first stage of the war. Now we have the gamble, sort of the second stage. Where are we now in Iraq? There's this feeling, there's been the recent election. Oh, things are getting better in Iraq. What's your view?
My view is that there are two fundamental misunderstandings that Americans have about this war. First was how tough the surge was. It was not just a matter of putting a few more troops out into Iraq. It was a very tough 6 months, probably the hardest phase of the war so far. The second theme of the book is this war is far from over. Yeah, the war has changed several times. It was an invasion, it morphed into an occupation, into an insurgency, then into a civil war, then into an American counteroffensive. It's changing again. Just because it's changing doesn't mean it's ended. The elections the other day? Yeah. Remember the elections a couple of years ago? Purple fingers, people coming out? Followed by a civil war. So I think there's a lot of reasons that Iraq '09 is going to be very tough, and in fact harder than the last year of Bush's war. And I think there's a good chance that Obama's war in Iraq will last longer than Bush's war.
So who gets this? Does the president get this? He talked about 16 months for moving troops. What do the commanders tell him? Where is there a clash coming here in terms of the ground truth versus what the president may think?
I think there will indeed might be a clash by the end of this year. Obama's campaign promise to get American combat troops out of Iraq in 16 months was a fatuous promise. When Americans heard it, what they heard was, I will have no more American troops dying in 16 months. Mm-hmm. But it was a false phraseology, combat troops. Well, newsflash for Obama, there is no such thing as non-combat troops. There is no pacifistic branch of the U.S. Army. Anytime you have American troops out there, there are going to be some of them fighting and dying in counter-terror missions against al-Qaeda. If you have American advisors with Iraqi troops, they're going to be getting into fights, and some Americans will be dying. So I think we're there for a long time, and as long as we're there, unlike, say, the occupations of Korea, Japan, or Germany, American troops will be engaged in combat. General Odierno says in the book he'd like to see 35,000 troops there as late as 2015, well into Obama will be Obama's second term. So I think by the end of this year, you're going to see a conflict. Obama's going to want to see troop numbers coming down. Odierno, the other big O, as they call him in Iraq, is going to say, wait a minute, you're holding general elections here in December in Iraq. That's exactly the wrong time to take troops out.
So let's look then at another Obama promise, which is related, of course, to Iraq, because Obama has talked about switching troops from Iraq to Afghanistan. But that switch hasn't happened. Where do things stand in terms of Afghanistan, and how does the ground truth in Iraq affect what's going to happen and can happen in Afghanistan?
They do relate to each other very much. The odd thing about Barack Obama's promise to get troops out of Iraq so he can use them in Afghanistan, it's not a departure from Bush, it actually is a continuation of Bush. It's the same unwarranted optimism that plagued the Bush administration about Iraq. Remember, the original Bush plan for Iraq was to be down to 30,000 troops by the fall of 2003. Here we are more than 5.5 years later with 5 times that many troops. So I think Obama's going to have more trouble getting troops out of Iraq than he suspects. You're also seeing a bit of friction right now in discussing where they go in Afghanistan, Pakistan. Now that's partly the shakedown cruise of a new administration. It's also because you got some pretty big egos out there. Richard Holbrooke, the new American envoy, and Dave Petraeus, who's now the U.S. commander for the whole Middle East, that's kind of like putting Godzilla and Mothra out there. They're both going to think they're in charge, and they're both going to be using their ray gun looks at each other. But I do think the Obama administration has gotten something fundamentally correct, which is it's not the Afghan war, it's the Afghan-Pakistan war. And the Pakistan part of it is the more important part of it. As a friend of mine, Andrew Exum, puts it, it's hard to fight a war in Afghanistan when the enemy decides to fight it in Pakistan.
Tom Ricks, thanks very much. Author of The Gamble. Thanks for being with us.
You're welcome.
You're watching Washington Unplugged at cbsnews.com/Washington Unplugged. And we want to hear from you. Please email us your questions and ideas for future shows of Washington Unplugged at WashingtonUnplugged@cbsnews.com. You can also become a fan of Bob Schieffer on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks for watching. as we walked you, the viewer, through the news from Washington and beyond.